Welcome to Lecture 19, The Skeptical Challenge to Optimism, David Hume. As I promised I would throughout the series, it's time again for me to remind you that nothing I say here is philosophical advocacy. My goal is to make systems of thought come alive from within, to let you know how in the 17th and 18th centuries the world could look to certain minds in ways that were of historical significance to the debates and the conceptions of the future. If you think back to the remarkable cultural response to Isaac Newton and the achievements of the new philosophy, to deism and its profoundly optimistic natural theology, its natural religion, and within Christian Europe, to Bishop Joseph Butler, one of the leading Christian theologians of the English-speaking Protestant world, and the providential natural optimism of his sermons on humane nature, we see that the foundation of 18th century optimistic natural philosophy and natural theology derived from two wonderfully confident conclusions that the 18th century inherited from the intellectual revolution of the 17th century. One, the belief that we possessed natural faculties, the senses, our natural reason, that through the medium of nature linked human beings to natural truth and to knowledge of God. We saw through nature to nature's author and to the designs of that author of nature. And two, that we now knew that nature and human beings interacted to the benefit of humanity through the providential designs of God. And we need not look merely to the deists for such a view. Who could have said that more profoundly than Bishop Joseph Butler of the Church of England? These are tidal movements in 18th century culture. These are tidal shifts in the way the culture thinks about the world, on which a large number of thinkers are merely the waves atop that tidal movement. But these movements of culture face severe countercurrents of skepticism about such optimistic conclusions. So before we turn to David Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion, let us examine several other challenges to natural optimism. First, and obviously, there is the challenge posed by evangelical religious revival. Such evangelical Christianity is a growing force throughout the 18th century. Best illustrated, for example, by George Whitefield and John Wesley, both of them profoundly influential throughout all of the British Isles, both of them profoundly influential in America as well. Evangelical Christianity denounced the folly of those who told us to follow nature, and worst of all, to follow human nature. Such naturalism in the evangelical view ignored the reality of the fall, the reality of human depravity, the sin and danger of this worldliness, the loss of the Christian message that we must flee the things of this world, and ignored our absolute dependence upon the supernatural for our ethics, for our goodness, and for our significant knowledge of God and the nature of reality. The world of 18th century new philosophy sought to marginalize the evangelicals as superstitious enthusiasts. John Wesley was a priest within the Church of England. It would only be much, much later, toward the end of the 18th century, when latitudinarian, new philosophical Christian bishops of the Church of England refused to ordain an adequate number of priests sympathetic to Wesley's evangelical movement, that Wesley broke with the Church of England and founded the Methodist Church that one associates with his name. When Wesley was a priest of the Church of England, itinerantly giving sermons throughout England, he needed the permission of bishops to preach in their diocese. When he came to Joseph Butler's diocese at Durham, Butler refused him that permission and said, "I will not have a madman speaking in my diocese." Secondly, there is, as a dramatic countercurrent to this philosophical and theological naturalism and optimism, something we've alluded to several times, the skepticism that is inherent in Lockean empiricism. Not only, as we have stressed, that it makes knowledge limited and relative to experience, but if you think of its theological implications, that it makes knowledge merely probable at best. It makes all knowledge merely probable. Is probability a sufficient foundation for the eternal truths of religion? Further, there are other skeptical problems emerging within empiricism, an empiricism that so underlies the entire new philosophical and theological optimism. Bishop George Berkeley, in his 3 dialogues concerning between Hylas and Philinus, Bishop George Berkeley raised the issue of what are the actual objects and units of experience. What's at the heart of the empirical claim? Our knowledge is bound by our experience. Well, what is it that we actually know? What are the units of experience? The units of experience, Berkeley argued, are all mental. They're ideas of the world. They are images of the world, representations of the world. They're ideas. Locke and others have made a wild leap beyond empiricism into the most speculative metaphysics in assuming that in addition to what we know, the content of our own minds, ideas, there's a world out there, independent of them, that not only corresponds to, but causes our ideas of the world. So, turning the empiricist criterion, our knowledge is limited to and bound by our experience, against the claims of empiricism itself as they're manifested around him, Berkeley argues that all we know are immaterial things. The world as we know it by empirical experience is ideal, not bodily, corporeal, material. Now, Berkeley's empirical immaterialism suffers an interesting fate. When the 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philinus are first published, they receive scant attention, but something about them has gotten under people's skin. A second edition sells quite well, A later third edition is one of the philosophical bestsellers of the 18th century. Everywhere, in England, in France, Germany, the Low Countries, new philosophers attempt to dismiss Berkeley as either mad or insincere. If he doesn't think the world is real, why doesn't he leave a building through the third story? What danger crossing the street with a carriage coming? Samuel Johnson says, I'll refute Berkeley, and kicks a rock. But this doesn't refute Berkeley. Berkeley has never said that we don't have images of a world that appears to us as material, but that all we know are our images and ideas. And just as there is an attempt to marginalize the evangelicals, there is an attempt to marginalize Berkeley and philosophical idealism, as it is called. But that is not a confident philosophical response. And the growing success of Berkeley's publications reveal, at the very least, a growing unease about and obsession with his conclusions. And a nagging doubt, is our system of knowledge as coherent and solid and stable as we believe? But the two most dramatic challenges to optimistic natural philosophy and natural theology would come from David Hume, the celebrated Scottish philosopher, metaphysician, epistemologist, moral philosopher, and indeed historian, and from, of all places, Voltaire, the most celebrated deistic thinker of the 18th century. In this lecture, we shall encounter Hume, in the next, Voltaire. Hume's most revealing and pointed work on natural optimism as it relates to natural religion or theology is a work unpublished until his death, but widely known among his friends, his dialogues concerning natural religion. His friends convince him it is too dangerous a work. And these friends are largely theologians. It is too dangerous a work to publish during his lifetime. In theory, it committed Hume to no particular view, since it was a dialogue among competing analyses of natural theology. An advocate, a traditionalist critic of the new philosophy, and a philosophical skeptic whom he names Philo. And Hume gave it, at the very end, after a long delay, a relatively safe final chapter that was added on as something of an afterthought on the advice of friends who were terribly worried about the judgment of him by posterity. But throughout the pages of Hume's dialogues, the voice of skeptical philosophy, Philo, was able to challenge the fundamental premise of natural religion, that by inference, induction, from the phenomena of nature, we were obliged as reasonable, rational, inductive, scientific minds to infer from that data of nature a cause of nature, and that cause had to be analogous to a human mind. That is, from the order and benevolence of nature, we had to infer an intelligent creator and designer, and that such a cause was God, intelligent, wise, omnipotent, and good. That is the premise of natural theology, natural religion, that Philo is going to criticize skeptically throughout the dialogues. Philo points out that such an argument, basing religion upon inference from experience, had four fatal flaws of a general nature. One, it left religion merely probable at best, since knowledge from experience was not logically necessary, but was determined by ongoing experience. That in theory, the believer in natural religion would have to say, well, so far I believe in God, but I'm waiting to see what I learn about nature tomorrow. That's not very satisfying for a natural theology. Secondly, for Philo, it proceeds this argument on the basis of an extremely weak analogy, because the dissimilarities between the universe and the work of an architect or the work of the designer of a machine, the similarities between the universe and the works of human beings were far less striking than the dissimilarities. And the implications of that scientifically were dramatic. There is a certain similarity between the movement of sap in trees and the circulation of blood in animals. They are analogous, but they are profoundly dissimilar. And it would be foolish in the extreme and an obvious source of error if one drew inferences about the causes of one from knowledge of the causes of the other. Someone dissects a mammal and says, that's the system of circulation. Now think, doing it on the basis of one, you say that's the system of circulation. Trees must have hearts, right? Where there are dissimilarities, they count profoundly in scientific inference. Even more dramatically, the entire analogy was wholly vitiated by the fact that the universe was the only one of its kind that we knew. It was not as if we had had experience of the necessary causes of a large number of universes, such that seeing yet another universe, we might infer something by analogy about the causes of this universe. In fact, we knew only one universe, and we knew that one, to say the least, very, very partially. We knew almost none of it. We had the most limited awareness of the most limited aspect of it. How then, scientifically, let alone with confidence, could one draw inferences about what had to be the necessary or even probable cause of a universe? Now, it is very important to remember and understand that the issue here is not the existence or non-existence of God. The issue is not ontological. The issue is epistemological. Did we know the existence of God by the specific means of inference from natural phenomena? Fourthly, Philo points out, in all scientific questions, in all matters of natural phenomena, negative evidence counts even more than positive evidence in the confirmation or disconfirmation of an hypothesis. If you say that the cause of successful plant growth is proximity to a house, and you show me one or two plants that grow well because they're near a house, and you ignore all the plants near a house that don't grow well, or plants that grow well far from a house, your tendentious selective use of evidence is the very opposite of science. When people talk about the necessary cause of this universe being a wise, designing, intelligent, omnipotent, good being, All they do, Philo claims, is look for positive evidence. And they show us order. Look at this extraordinary day. We needed rain, we got the rain, and the plants grow. What about drought? What about flood? What about storms that destroyed the patient work of human beings? What about stars that collided? What about catastrophe? To cite order is not enough because there is evidence of disorder. And both require explanation by the cause that one assigns to the universe. What then convinces us that this universe could not have arranged itself by chance, without design, such that we say some things will work, some things won't, some things will show signs of order, some things of chaos and disorder. But Hume wants to go yet further. That's always true about David Hume. Even if one granted the terms of this vitiated analogy, if one granted it to the natural religionists and followed its principle that like causes, like effects, prove like causes, that like effects prove like causes. The world is like a machine designed by an intelligent man, therefore the cause of the world must be like human intelligence, only infinitely greater. Even if one granted the analogy, Hume argues, we would not logically infer from the universe, by such an analogy, the God of natural religion. By analogy, the evidence of the universe would conclude against the essential attributes of God. The cause of the world would not have the qualities of the God believed in by proponents of natural or indeed other religions. For example, God must be infinite, but the universe has only finite effects. Everything we see in the universe is finite, so by analogy, the cause of the universe should be finite. One looks at a human machine, one says it's finite, its cause is finite. One looks at the universe, one says everything in it is finite, its cause is finite. We would not infer perfection because there are so many flaws in the world. Indeed, looking at the astonishing number of flaws in the world, it might be just as plausible by analogy to say that this was a botched and rejected work by some child deity who showed it and said, look, I've created a world. And a better God, you call this a world, and threw it away, and we find ourselves in the midst of it, living in the midst of his failure. Nor would we infer the essential theological attribute of the unity of God from the analogy to the works of human beings. If we see something so small in comparison to the universe as the most complex battleship in the Royal Navy, what do we infer? It couldn't have been done by one mind, by one hand, by one being. This is the collective work of a large number of people specialized in different things. From the size and diversity of the universe, we would infer that many beings created the world. We would not infer the incorporeality, the spirituality of God, because in all of our experience, we only know work to be made by material agencies, by hands, by bodies. We have never seen the design of an architect become a building without physical agency intervening. So by analogy, the cause of the universe must have body. Nor must we infer intelligence on the assumption that this world is a machine requiring an intelligent designer. If we held to the analogy, in fact, we should proceed from the assumption that the world resembles an organic vegetable with growth and decay much more than it does a watch or a knitting loom. Perhaps, Philo argues ironically, it comes from a supreme seed. Or indeed, much about the world resembles a living being, an animal, more than a machine. Perhaps it becomes from a supreme egg, whom we ought to infer. Now, Hume is not arguing for any of these specific conclusions, to say the least, but seeking to discredit the entire natural theological enterprise. Nor would we infer supreme wisdom for the obvious reason that human beings improve on the design of nature all the time. What is medicine, if not an improvement upon nature? What is our care of the young and elderly, if not such an improvement? What is agriculture, if not an animal husbandry, if not an improvement upon the design of nature? We make countless improvements and rearrangements of things. Further, even in nature, change is constant. Parts relate well for a while, then they don't, then things fall apart and die. Is that like a machine made by a perfect and infinitely wise artisan? Things work for a while, then fall apart, then die. How infer a perfect creator from that? Nor, if one turns to the problem of evil, can one infer the God of theology. If nature proves the infinite goodness of its causes, then why does a survey of all human literature reveal to us a litany of the miseries, pains, and uncertainties of life? If a good and wise parent could save children from disease, from earthquake, from plague, from painful death, it would. If it didn't, we wouldn't call that parent good and wise. What does that do to the analogy from nature? The partisans of natural religion cite the survival of the species as the mark of the infinite goodness of the Creator. But the species survive, and negative evidence counts more, by their mutual war, by a kind of brute and blind force that involves the misery, mutual slaughter, and mutual consummation of countless individual beings. To know that the world is not what we would expect or predict of a perfect, infinite, omnipotent, loving deity walk into any children's ward in a hospital, Hume says. Look at the suffering children in pain, and would you say, this is what I would predict from an infinitely good, infinitely wise, infinitely powerful cause? Why finite, imperfect human beings could improve upon nature if consulted. How? For starters, eliminate pain. Proceed by particular, not general law, such that the good live longer and the wicked die sooner. Expand the powers and faculties of human life and mind, and correct the inaccurate workmanship that gives us catastrophic floods from rain and catastrophic drought from heat. There are, Philo reasons, 4 and only 4 logical possibilities to be weighed in the light of the evidence. The world could be only as we observe it if, 1, its cause were infinitely good. 2, if its cause were evil. 3, if its cause was composed of warring opposites of good and evil. Or 4, if the cause of the universe was neither good nor evil. Perfect goodness is disproven by pain, suffering, and imperfection. Perfect malice is disproven by pleasure and well-being. Warring opposites are disproven by the uniformity of the general laws of nature, which leaves us only the final explanation that the cause of the universe was something indifferent to good and evil. In short, from Philo's arguments as offered by Hume, one might choose to believe in God, but it would not be from the optimistic perspective that our natural faculties, through the medium of nature, know God and God's goodness, and should use the nature created by God as its moral guide. Thank you very much.